Spoiler alert, ladies and gentlemen, this one has a happy ending.
Oh, it does. Isn't it a great piece of script writing?
Actually, has all the makings. I think it has all the features of a great movie. Indeed, I've seen the famous movie by Ron Howard with Tom Hanks and Kevin Bacon and a few other famous actors and actresses. So, what actually happened on Apollo 13? It had people on the edge of their seats who were around in April 1970. What actually happened?
Well, that's what I mean about it being a great piece of script writing. But let's come back to that later.
Okay.
50 years ago, on Saturday, the 11th of April, Apollo 13 was launched. This was obviously following the sequence of Apollo 11, which was July 1969, Apollo 12, which was December 1969, and now we have April 1970. We have Apollo 13. And all went well to start with. It did its normal stunt of launching, and it was a perfectly normal launch. It took off, and tens of thousands of people were watching it, not as many as on Apollo 11, but tens of thousands on Cocoa Beach in Florida watching this incredible rocket take off, 365 foot high, 3,000 tons, lumbered up into the air. 2 minutes after it fired its engines, all of the 5 F1 engines, that's why it's called Saturn V, because it had 5 engines, and disappears from view 2 minutes after launch. Get up in the sky, it's about 40 miles high, about 60 miles downrange. This is the point at which the first stage, which is where most of the fuel was kept, detaches, and it continues then on. And we then, at that point, after it's disappeared from sight and out of camera range, we have to rely on NASA to tell us what's going to happen. And it was all very routine, and it was nothing much particularly happening until it got to about halfway to the moon, when we had the famous radio communication, "Houston, we seem to have a problem."
And that's a classic, isn't it?
It's a classic. That was Jim Lovell, who was commander at the time. He radioed back to Houston that they had a problem, and so they had to find out what the problem was.
Big understatement as well, apparently. Typical astronauts' coolness and sort of stoicism.
Stoicism and cool under pressure. Well, that's what astronauts are supposed to be. They're all fighter pilots, test pilots. They've experienced unforeseen events. Anyway, Houston, we have a problem. And what the problem was, as it turned out, was one of the oxygen tanks in the service module, which is below the command module. You've got the command module sitting on top of the cylindrical service module where all the consumables were, where all the rocket engines were to maneuver it. And on top of the command module, of course, was the lunar lander, the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, in 2 parts, upper and lower section. So they were trying to work out what on earth happened. There was obviously an explosion of some sort, and there was obviously something was not right within the command module because all the oxygen levels were falling very rapidly. So they worked out pretty soon that one of the oxygen tanks had exploded, and there they were, on their way to the moon, and you can't just sort of stop, turn around and come back. Spacecraft don't have brakes. You can't stop. Maybe you could turn it round and fire your rocket, but you're going at a fair old speed at this point. You're being slowed down by the Earth's gravity. Earth's escape velocity is 25,000 miles an hour.
This is the translunar injection. Which,
yeah, that's right.
Once they do that, you can't really stop until you get to the moon.
Well, get to the moon, and that's the only point at which you can actually not slow down. You can go around the back of the moon and use the moon's gravity to put you into a lunar orbit, if that's what you want to do. So we're halfway to the moon. Big bang. Whoops. So they hurried radio communication, hurried decisions. What do we do? Well, you've got to go on to the moon. You can't just stop and come back. You've got to go around the back of the moon and come back from there, which is what they eventually worked out they were going to have to do.
Pretty scary because the service module, I mean, for those of you who are familiar, you've probably seen like the cone-shaped command module, which is the pressurized section where it's the pressurized cabin for the crew, the 3 astronauts. The service module, the cylindrical bit underneath, which you explained. The service module contained all the water, all the oxygen, all the things needed to purify the air, which was the scrubbers.
Right.
things like that. The dehumidifiers, the fuel for the rockets, everything was in that service module, apart from a small amount needed for the re-entry, which was in the command module.
That's right.
Which meant that they suddenly now didn't have those things because the service module actually stopped working at this point.
Yes, and of course they still had to get back to Earth, which required a degree of power within the command module, because it's the command module which is going to bring them back to Earth, not the service module that's discarded and goes into orbit around the sun, or burns up in the Earth's atmosphere, depending on where they release it. And the only other thing remaining is the lunar lander. So what they decide to do, cut long story short, they decide that they're going to, all three of them, move into the lunar lander so they can shut down the power on the command module to save it for when they need it for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. So they're going to have to spend the best part of 4 days in the lunar lander. Now there's a problem here because the lunar lander is not designed to support 3 people for 3 days. It's designed to support 2 people for 1 day. In the case of Apollo 13, it was going to support them for a much shorter period of time than they were planning on spending in it. Now, the problem with that is that when you're in a spacecraft, you're breathing out and breathing in. So there's an atmosphere within the spacecraft. There has to be pressurization. Otherwise, we're all going to get the bends and our blood will boil and it'll be very unpleasant. So we have to have a pressurization within the craft, which is fine. That was available. But in order to make sure the air that the astronauts were breathing, they had to remove the carbon dioxide, which every human breathes out, from the atmosphere. And that's done with what's called lithium dioxide scrubbers. Basically, the air is passed through this charcoal-like filter, and the lithium dioxide crystals inside it remove the carbon dioxide, and then you don't breathe it in, and so if you breathed in too much carbon dioxide, you wouldn't survive very long.
Yeah, it's like they use them at my hospital, actually, in some of the machines. These crystals turn pink when they actually absorb carbon dioxide, but this chemical compound that's created takes the carbon dioxide out of the air, because, as you just said, it would kill you if you breathe too much of it. It'll actually kill you. Yeah.
But there's a problem here, because we're told they spent the best part of 4 days in the lunar lander with this scrubber, because they had to work out how to rig it up. And there was one rather major design flaw. The lithium dioxide, carbon dioxide scrubbers in the command module, because they were there as well, were not the same shape as the lithium dioxide, carbon dioxide scrubbers in the lunar lander. And one was square. So they had to work out how to ensure that the scrubbers that they removed from the command module would work in the lunar lander.
So they had to fit a round peg into a square hole.
It was a round hole in the lunar lander, and the scrubbers were square. But there's another problem here, which I don't have the answer to. I'll give you the problem, which is that these lithium dioxide scrubbers only last for a certain amount of time, and then they have to be recharged or replaced. If you recharge them, which you can do, you put it into a vacuum and that will remove it, or you regenerate it, or you replace it. And the proposal was that they would replace them, but they didn't have enough to replace them. They were only carrying about 3 or 4. They should have been carrying about 50 for the amount of time. So there is an anomaly here, which has never been addressed properly, that the scrubbers that were carried would not last as long as the mission. Because if you start breathing in carbon dioxide, you're going to feel very unwell very soon.
And you have to heat these things up, and you have to be able to release them out of the craft. And that's not possible basically inside a closed atmosphere, because you just release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere.
That's a good point, because you've got to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and if you're going to regenerate the scrubber, you have to do it outside the atmosphere you're about to breathe in. So another anomaly rears its head. Did they just sort of open the window and hang it out the window until it got clean? No, of course not. They couldn't do that. We're in space, don't forget. There's a vacuum in space. There's a major discrepancy between the consumables, the oxygen and the water, and all the other things that humans need to survive, there's a discrepancy between what was known to be available and what they would have consumed within this very, very small space. The lunar lander is not really designed for anything much more than 2 people being taken down to the lunar surface.
So they had 3 guys in this tiny little space.
It's the same as sitting in your car. That's about the same amount of space. It's about 200 cubic feet of space, which is more or less the same as the average car. So it's like 3 people sitting in a car. You know, there are going to be certain bodily functions that require to be done. If you're going to spend 3 or 4 days in space, you've got to eat, you've got to sleep, you've got to do all the other things. They didn't appear to have any problem because there are pictures of these 3 astronauts on Apollo 13 looking moderately comfortable in the lunar lander. And we all know that the lunar lander is a very, very small craft. So we got another anomaly here. This story is so full of anomalies, and we haven't even come to the biggest one yet.
You can't help wondering about this. Now, again, it's the. I mean, I know the astronauts are very cool and everything. They were almost too cool. Now, there's a chap who's done a reconstruction of the mission using computer-generated imagery of the craft, and he's put on all the radio messages and things like that. It's in a long YouTube video. Some of the dialogue's a little bit forced.
Yeah.
I mean, even the "we have a problem" thing, that is very similar to a line in the story, because it was a story created in both a book and a film at the same time, 2001: A Space Odyssey. The film was not an adaptation. Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke came up with the story together and produced both at the same time.
Yeah.
But there's a scene where the HAL, the computer, eventually goes crazy and kills one of the crew. He says, "We have a problem, Dave." That was 3 years before this mission. I just note the similarity. There's many similarities between that film and these missions. But the movie script metaphor is actually quite a good one, Marcus. It really is.
Most people do confuse the two, the real mission and the film of the mission. And most people will have seen the film of the mission. It's a very good film, very professionally made. And they portray the problems that they've experienced and how they solve them, and they portray it very well. But the film lasts about an hour and a half. This mission lasts several days. So a great deal had been condensed. So obviously they took the highlights of the mission and transferred that to the film.
Yeah, it's almost 5 days they were actually in space, and the churches were filling up with people praying.
That's right.
And there were people like biting their nails watching TV.
Yeah, it was very fraught at the time. I'm old enough to have been around when it happened. I was caught up in it all. I thought, what a wonderful experience they must be having. And then they got back and everybody was delighted. Pleased.
That's like every good movie. It has a happy ending. Like the Soviets had loads, and they lost several dozen astronauts. For something going wrong to this extent in space, I mean, I don't include Apollo 1 because, well, that was a space disaster, but the rocket was on the ground. But is there any other occasion where a disaster of this magnitude has occurred and the crew actually survive?
To be honest, I can't think of one off the top of my head. There may well have been. There have been several close shaves, but the annals of space travel, obviously we don't know what happens in China, whether they've had a few problems or not. But the Apollo missions were live on television, so we were going to see them all. We were going to be part of it. It was all part of the whole propaganda behind Apollo.
I mean, there was an event several years ago, I remember, where a rocket took off from Baikonur, a Soyuz. It was on its way to the International Space Station. I think this was 2017 or 2016. The rocket experienced some problems, and the capsule detached. But when it detached, I mean, it opened its parachute. And they just landed, and they were fine. Of course, astronauts do die. 7 died on the Challenger and Columbia. I mean, I don't think the Russians have come clean about all the disasters they had. But this was on TV. Everyone was looking at it. It had all the chances of ending in tragedy. And then it didn't. Capsule comes down, and the guys get out, and they're smiling, and they're happy. And the whole world is cheering with relief.
Yes.
And these 3 guys are obviously very relieved.
Yeah, it was
what a story. What an amazing tale to tell your grandchildren. An
extraordinary story, if it was true. I mean, once you get past the emotion of the event, and obviously it was a very emotional event at the time, it was 1970, this is the height of the Vietnam War, Cold War still going on, and the space race appears to be being won by America, so good luck to them. But when you start looking into the detail of this Apollo 13, It all starts, as I said, quite normally, and then you get this oxygen tank exploding. Now, an oxygen tank exploding is not a sort of gentle puff of oxygen into the service module, because that's where it was. It's a big bang, and there's an explosion. Now, in space, Newton's first law of motion applies. An object will remain in motion unless acted upon by another force. The explosion of an oxygen tank is another force acting on this spacecraft. So why was it not thrown seriously off course? There's no record in the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal of them trying to find out where on Earth they were, how to get back on track. They could presumably look out the window and see the moon at some point, so they know roughly where they were going to be going. But if the spacecraft was traveling in a completely indeterminate direction as a result of this explosion...
Yeah, it's like a mini rocket engine.
But if you've got an explosion in space, an unscheduled explosion, an unscheduled maneuver off course, you then got to get back on course. But there's no record of them having done so. That I find particularly strange. And also, even more strange is, right, this oxygen tank explodes. There's a reasonable explanation for why it happened. But how did they know it happened? NASA claimed to have done analysis on the telemetry, which I thought they'd lost, but never mind. The astronauts come back to Earth in the command module. They've jettisoned the service module. It's either burnt up in the Earth's atmosphere or it's gone into orbit around the sun. How could they inspect it? They didn't have it there. They could only take what they thought was the action. The official explanation, believe it or not, is that it was caused by a short circuit in the electrical connections to the motor driving the paddle, which agitated the oxygen, which is liquid, agitated the oxygen in the tank. That's the official explanation. And it was short-circuited by a lump of solder that had become loose. Hang on a minute. How on earth could you work that out?
Yeah, I mean, there's one photograph of the Odyssey. That's the spacecraft's name. You see like a hole in it. It's a big square. It looks like actual damage as such. It just looks like what we were talking about on Neil's show the other day, where it's like someone's taken the bonnet off to look underneath. This was taken by someone from the command module. The only reason they could take this photograph was because the command module had separated from the service module at that time. It was going for re-entry. Apparently they were very worried at that time because that was one of the most critical parts of the mission. There must have been some kind of blast from this thing for it to have damaged the heat shield.
The heat shield, which is the bit that protects the command module as it enters the Earth's atmosphere, it's an essential part of any spacecraft. All spacecraft have heat shields because spacecraft don't have brakes any more than they have steering wheels. They don't have brakes, so they can't slow down. So as they come back to Earth, traveling at the same speed they enter the Earth's atmosphere as they left it, 25,000 miles an hour, they've got to slow down because you don't want to land at 25,000 miles an hour. You wouldn't survive, obviously. So you use a heat shield to protect you as the frictional load from the atmosphere builds up and heats the heat shield, which is made of a resin-type material, which is what's called ablative, i.e. it will destroy itself and protect whatever is behind it. That's the problem they've got right now with Orion. They can't work out how on earth to protect it. So you've got to maneuver your craft. If you come in too high, if you come in at 8 degrees, you're likely to burn up. If you come in at 4 degrees, you're likely to bounce off the atmosphere and go into orbit around Earth, and it'll be very difficult to get back. So you've got to come into a very precise angle. So how did they achieve this? Now, when you're moving at 25,000 miles an hour, you haven't got much time to change direction, which you can do with the service propulsion module on the craft. You do have a degree of control over it, but not the angle of re-entry. And all the Apollo craft seem to come in at the right angle.
Was the service module completely and utterly foobar? Was anything working on it? Because apparently it completely broke down.
But there were 2 oxygen tanks. The oxygen was used to generate electricity. They were basically part of a fuel cell. They closed the whole command module down so that they didn't have to use as much electricity because there were 2 oxygen tanks on board. They had part of one of them left. So they had enough oxygen, they calculated, to generate enough electricity to power up the command module so it could re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. And that was done relatively soon before the actual re-entry.
The actual main engine on the command module wasn't working. They had to use the lunar module engines. I mean, they've got two. They've got the descent and ascent engines. And they actually used these to get away from the moon and back to Earth, apparently. It was to maneuver the craft as it did a slingshot around the moon, apparently.
They aimed for the moon, they got to the moon, we're told, and then they had to fire the 10,000-pound thrust rocket engine, which would officially have landed them on the lunar surface if it had all worked, to slow the craft down sufficiently that the gravitational attraction of the moon would capture the craft, and it would then go into orbit around the moon, and when they got round the other side, they would fire the engine again to propel it out of lunar orbit back towards Earth. Now, all this requires a considerable amount of sophisticated direction and timing, and their computer didn't really have that capability. We're told it had the same computing power as a wristwatch, which may or may not be the case. It worked in a slightly different way, or the Apollo guidance computer. But it wasn't autonomous. It couldn't do something by itself. It had to be told what to do at any given moment in time. Now, the astronauts would have had to plotted where they were using, get this, a sextant. It's the sort of thing that was used by sailing ships years ago, where you could take a reading off a star, usually Polaris, the pole star, and see what the angle was above the horizon, so you knew what time it was. But obviously you needed a clock that was reliable enough to get the time. On a spacecraft, you haven't got a horizon because it's all space. So you'd have to take a reading off either the moon or the Earth. And you'd have to have certain stars on which you take the reading. It starts to get a bit complicated at this point. But anyway, having said all that, and it is complicated, they managed to get back all right. Now, coming back in a spacecraft from the lunar orbit, it's the equivalent of standing on top of the Empire State Building, 1,200 feet above the ground. Well, you standing on top of the Empire State Building, holding a marble, and me standing on the pavement below it with a beer mug, 3 inches in diameter, and you dropping that marble and me catching it in the beer mug 6 times on the trot. That's what we're told to believe about Apollo. I said they could only enter a certain angle, and that slot through which they had to enter was 40 miles wide and 7 miles high.
God.
If you scale that down, it's the size of a beer mug at the bottom of the Empire State Building.
Yeah,
that's what
240,000 miles.
Yeah, and this is with the technology of the 1960s in spacecraft designed with slide rules. There were no such things as computer-aided design, and there's a delay in communication between the Earth and the Moon, 2.5 seconds. 1.3 seconds there, 1.3 seconds back. So with all these anomalies, we have the safe return of Apollo 13. It managed to survive being blown off course. It managed to circumnavigate the moon and fire its rockets at exactly the right time. If they'd fired it too early, they'd have gone into a much wider orbit and spent much longer. They got back to Earth, they got the right entry angle, the right entry speed, and they slowed down sufficiently so that they could then deploy their 3 big red and white parachutes, and they could land in the Pacific, and they get picked up by the helicopters, taken back to the rescue ship, and get greeted by the world. Film contracts, such like. That's the story. That's the official Apollo 13 story as recounted in Ron Howard's film of Apollo 13 starring Tom Hanks. Don't forget, they've all got the right stuff.
Also, when you think about it, they didn't know the Apollo missions were going to be cancelled. They assumed, like everyone else did, the space exploration would continue to progress, as we discussed on Neil's show the other day. So I'd have just been thinking, oh, sod the moon, we'll get a chance to go back next year. It's like getting your legs blown off when you're about to go skiing and thinking to yourself, damn it, I was looking forward to that chalet in St. Moritz. It's absurd.
Yes. It's interesting. The commander of Apollo 13 was Jim Lovell. He was one of only 3 astronauts, the others were Gene Cernan and John Young, who actually flew on 2 Apollo missions. That's why only 24 astronauts, not the 27 you would expect if there were 3 astronauts on 9 missions, which there were.
So 3 of them got the chance to go back again.
Yes, and Jim Lovell, he was on Apollo 8, which didn't land, and he was on Apollo 13, which didn't land. So he made 2 attempts to walk on the moon and failed. Oh.
But it astonishes me, because not just for the simple fact that they're in this terrible predicament, which they understood perfectly well, being very, very highly trained and cool-headed astronauts they were. Already Lovell was on his 2nd mission. He just thought, well, it's rather a strange reaction, I thought, that they expressed this feeling. And again, it's rather like something you write, not in a good movie script, but in a bad movie script.
Well, it's basically a piece of imagination, the whole thing.
What date were they actually scheduled to land?
Sort of land on the 14th.
So the moon is just waxing past half.
That's right, yeah. And they were going to be landing at a place called Frau Moreau, which is just to the left of center.
Well, left of center is basically virtually on the Terminator.
Exactly. Now, all Apollo spacecraft landed close to the Terminator because the shadows would be longer, which would make better photographs, and they were always landing with the sun behind them. So if they overshot, they'd be in trouble because they couldn't see where they were going to land, because there isn't much ambient light on the moon. It's either light or it's dark. Despite people claiming that the lunar surface has a special reflective property.
Oh, yes.
Because it reflects light, you can see the damn thing. Look out the window. There's the moon. It reflects light. It's sunlight it's reflecting. But the moon is orbiting the Earth. It's also rotating on its own axis, or revolving on its own axis. So it's a fairly complex dance that is going on all the time.
What would actually be the situation? Would it be complete darkness, or would it be just past the Terminator?
To be fair, I haven't seen the actual calculation. It was done, I think it was Celestron, which is an astronomy software that you can use. You can put any dates and times and any planet into it and see exactly where you are. And that was how it was calculated. The landing site would have been in darkness.
It's actually sort of quite considerably to the southwest of the centre. I think, based on what I've seen on this particular database, it would have been over the Terminator. Just so you can see, actually, on this, just Google Frau Moreau, and It's got like a spot which shows you where it is. It's actually not near the centre. It's about halfway, I'd say, to the southwestern limb of the moon, which would put it in darkness. Darkness.